to work. As our soft guardrails have weakened, we've grown increasingly vulnerable to anti-democratic leaders. Donald Trump, a serial norm breaker, widely and correctly criticized for assaulting America's democratic norms. But the problem did not begin with Trump. The process of norm erosion started decades ago, long before Trump descended an escalator to announce his presidential candidacy. In a 1978 congressional race in northwestern Georgia, Newt Gingrich made his third bid for office in a district outside Atlanta. After two previous failed runs as a self-identified liberal Republican, he finally won, this time as a conservative, capturing a district that hadn't been in Republican hands in 130 years. Gingrich's bespectacled academic look he had been a history professor at a local university. His chirpy speech, his thick mop of hair, bushy sideburns belied a ruthlessness that would help transform American politics. In June of his 1978 campaign, Gingrich had met with a group of college Republicans at an Atlanta airport Holiday Inn, wooing them with a blunter, more cutthroat version of politics than they were accustomed to. He found a hungry audience. Gingrich warned the young Republicans to stop using Boy Scout words, which would be great around the campfire, but are lousy in politics. He continued, "You're fighting a war. It is a war for power. This party does not need another generation of cautious, prudent, careful, bland, irrelevant quasi-leaders. What we really need are people who are willing to stand up in a slugfest. What's the primary purpose of a political leader? To build a majority." When Gingrich arrived in Washington in 1979, his vision of politics as warfare was at odds with that of the Republican leadership. House Minority Leader Bob Michel, an amiable figure who carpooled home to Illinois for congressional recesses with his Democratic colleague, Dan Rostenkowski, was committed to abiding by establishing norms of civility and bipartisan cooperation. Gingrich rejected this approach as, quote, too soft. Winning a Republican majority, Gingrich believed, would require playing harder form of politics. Backed by a small but growing group of loyalists, Gingrich launched an insurgency aimed at instilling a more combative approach. Taking advantage of a new media technology, C-SPAN, Gingrich used adjectives like rocks, deliberately employing over-the-top rhetoric. He described Congress as corrupt and sick. He questioned his Democratic rivals' patriotism. He compared them to Mussolini and accused them of trying to destroy our country. According to former Georgia State Democratic Party leader Steve Anthony, the things that came out of Gingrich's mouth, we had never heard that before from either side. Gingrich went so far over the top that the shock factor rendered the opposition frozen for a few years. Through a new political action committee, GOPAC, Gingrich and his allies worked to spread these tactics across the party. GOPAC produced more than 2,000 training audio tapes, distributed each month to get the recruits of Gingrich's Republican Revolution on the same rhetorical page. Gingrich's former press secretary, Tony Blankley, compared the tactic of audio tape distribution to one used by the Ayatollah Khomeini on his route to power in Iran. In the early 90s, Gingrich and his team distributed memos to Republican candidates instructing them to use certain negative words to describe Democrats, call them, including the words pathetic, sick, bizarre, betray, anti-flag, anti-family, and traitors. It was the beginning of a seismic shift in American politics. Even as Gingrich ascended to Republican leadership structure, becoming a minority whip in 1989 and Speaker of the House in 1995, he refused to abandon his hardline rhetoric. and rather than repelling the party, he pulled it to him. By the time he became Speaker, Gingrich was a role model to a new generation of Republican legislators, many of them elected in the 1994 landslide that gave GOP its first House majority in 40 years. The Senate was likewise transformed by the arrival of Gingrich senators whose ideology, aversion to compromise, willingness to obstruct legislation helped speed the end of the body's traditional folkways. Well, this kind of brings us up to the current time that I'm well too aware of. And I don't really want to read through all the details of this particular period, but let me just make a few observations about it. I was told that when I came to D.C. as a senator, I'd see a very different Senate from the one I witnessed as an intern. Enormous difference between 1976 and the Senate I'd witnessed working for Congress in the 1980s and coming back here in 2009 to take an office. And a huge piece of that was certainly the deep animosity between the parties and the determination of the minority really running both ways to paralyze the majority. The Gingrich strategy was, don't try to get a few amendments into the bills the other side has. It just makes them look good because they're getting stuff done, and it doesn't create a case to show that they should be out of power and you should be in power. So instead, obstruct, 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 and then make the case they didn't do the job well, and therefore elect us. And this was powerfully successful. And a leader of the Senate said, Gingrich gives obstruction a good name. But here in the Senate, the opportunity to obstruct is so much larger in the House. We have nominations that take up a significant amount of time. So by drawing out those votes, you can eat up a lot of time. In fact, that strategy employed by Democrats has led to a nuclear option a couple weeks ago, in which for the first time we're doing blocks of nominees in a single vote. That had been done previously, but only with unanimous consent, saying every senator had looked over the list and said none of them were objectionable. Now that list may be full of objectionable individuals who by quality of character or by experience are totally unsuited to the post to which they've been nominated, but they're just going to be floated in. To me, it's a terrible abdication of the advice and consent clause of the Constitution, and therefore one more check and balance that has been profoundly eroded. But it was triggered by all-out obstruction, slowing down the process by the Democratic minority, just as the Republican minority had done in a previous cycle. In addition, policy bills require 60 votes in the Senate to close debate. Now, this is an artifice that stems from a transition that began in the 1830s. That transition was Southern Democrats giving up on the ability to have states nullify bills they didn't like, decided that the only way that was left for them was to stop bills from ever getting passed in the first place, and therefore talk them to death. Keep giving speeches on the bills, and then make a new motion, like to refer the bill to committee, or to adjourn, or to do this amendment or that amendment, each motion allowing 2 more speeches for each senator under the original Rule 4 of the Senate, and thereby enabling talk to go on infinitely, and wrapping that ability to talk infinitely in the First Amendment, making it a glorious feature of the U.S. Senate, a complete reversal of Jefferson's guidance in the early Senate, which is embodied in his Book of Conduct for the Senate, to speak directly, engage in no superfluous talk, and proceed, therefore, to get to the nut of the question, hear everyone, make a decision, and move on. This was the opposite. This was glorifying obstruction. And this term that came to describe this ability to do endless speeches and glorify obstruction was the term piracy, utilizing the Dutch word freebooter, which in Caribbean slang was filibustero, and thus the pirates have taken over the Senate. And so here we are with obstruction being routine by the minority of the majority to make the case they can't govern, get out of the way, and of course reinforced emphatically by the different cable television channels that proceed to say our side, our viewpoint is glorious and righteous, and their viewpoint is misguided and or evil. Each side saying that and driving the 2 parties further apart. And then social media proceeding to launch in on top of all of that, kind of cementing the differences. And if that's not enough, then money in campaigns used for slander attacks by dark money groups that sometimes reveal who they are and often don't, but almost all the money goes into slander attacks. Some more than half, what did I see, 70 or 80% is factually incorrect. It's just making up attacks on people and putting it out there because it works. When people hear horrific accusations against someone, it does in fact make them less likely to vote for that person because they don't have the time and effort or the ability to figure out what's true and what's not true. So lies work. Negative advertisements work. So if you have been on the receiving end of such ads, and probably just about everyone here has, that also hardens the opposition between the parties. So there we are, caught in this cycle of obstruction. And as I mentioned many hours ago, this strategy was really symbolized to me by a memo that I received in, I believe, April of 2009, written by Frank Luntz, a consultant who helped the Republican Party refine its pitch. And it said, in essence, whatever Democrats propose to improve health care, we will attack it and call it a government takeover. And he went on to elaborate why they had done focus groups. And in these focus groups, they had proposed different phrases. And the one that got the biggest negative response was government takeover. So regardless of whether a policy had any element of government takeover, that was the term that was going to be used. And I came down to the floor here in one of my first speeches and said, this is scary. This is inappropriate. Have we really come to the point that the goal of basically nearly half the senators is simply to obstruct and to misrepresent a policy because they don't want anything to be improved? They don't want the healthcare system to be improved. They just want to make sure that nothing good is done so they can kick out the majority party and they can become the majority party. And the answer, in the end, basically, in the 17 years I've been here, is pretty much the answer. That both sides, their top goal is getting back in the majority so they can do good things. But when they're in the majority, they're obstructed by the minority, and the cycle continues, and the frustrations continue. And the ineffectiveness of the Senate in addressing a rapidly changing world, well, that proceeds to feed cynicism about whether our model of government is up to the task. So fixing this system to work better is a step in the direction of addressing better policies in this rapidly evolving economy, new technologies, and by so doing, affirming to folks that our system works, that we shouldn't desire or seek out an authoritarian strategy for the future. And yet here we are with that authoritarian strategy in full gear, being deeply embraced certainly by the president, but also by the leadership tied to the president's party. And that part I would so like to see change. Find a way to take ourselves out of this cycle of paralysis and animosity and actually say, so what are the ways we can make the healthcare system work better? Let's get it done regardless of who's in the majority. That would be a huge improvement that America would like to see. Well, I'm going to fast forward to the next section because I think I've summed up the challenges that have been raised, not all of them. And one of the pieces that is the spread of this use of the filibuster into every crevice of our congressional operations. Before 1965, this process of talking bills to death was basically done on final passage of policy bills. It wasn't done on amendments. It wasn't done on motions to proceed to bills. It wasn't done on nominations. Not because it couldn't be done, but because the norms of the Senate were not that you should use this obstruction except on policy bills of great consequence that you passionately opposed. And essentially, the bills that were the target of filibusters were civil rights bills. Southern Democrats determined to block civil rights from being restored. My party, until my party changed. Now, the Republican Party was founded as an anti-slavery party. So it was more supportive of ensuring civil rights for all Americans. But Southern Democrats, they wanted to block the ability of Southern Black Americans from being able to register to vote. And so the filibuster was used mostly on civil rights issues, including issues regarding lynching and registration, voting, so forth. After 65, people started to say, well, hey, this lost some of its racist taint. Barack Obama called it the Jim Crow relic because that's what it was used mostly for, was the oppression of civil rights. But it lost some of that taint after 1965. It started to be used gradually and then more rapidly until you basically can't sneeze here without facing a new version of the filibuster. Now, the old version was you talked a bill to death, new motions, new speeches, never allowing to get to a final vote. But then that changed dramatically when we had a battle in 1917 over arming commercial ships. And that battle was because Woodrow Wilson wanted to arm them, but a small group of senators said, you know, if you arm commercial ships, that means we're going to be using arms against German submarines or German ships that are threatening ours, which means we'll be in war, and there's been no declaration of war, so this is an overstep of presidential power, and we should not do this. Now, that view was held passionately by few, but was the clear minority position. It's a small group that felt so strongly about it. But they used the filibuster up to the transition of government in 1917. And that transition then occurred in March, not in January as it does now. And La Follette of Wisconsin was leading the opposition. And he wanted so badly to speak in the final moments up to 12 noon when the government was going to change over because the transition between presidencies. And he got so frustrated, he took one of these brass urns that are relics themselves. They're basically spittoons for people to spit their tobacco into, back when tobacco was allowed to be chewed here on the floor of the Senate. He took one of those urns and he threw it across the well of the Senate. That's how frustrated he was. The well of the Senate, this space in front of me right now that curves around and has tables in it. It's hard to imagine somebody grabbing one of those spittoons and tossing it across the well in frustration, but that's how much he wanted to give the final speech to kill this bill. But Wilson, President Wilson, immediately and effectively vilified what La Follette was doing. He referred to a small band of men and had some nice fancy language in it, obstructing the entire will of the nation as embodied in this great institution, and how this institution could not go forward to address the issues that it was facing unless it restored its ability, which led immediately upon the reconstitution the next couple days of a new rule that said you can close debate if a supermajority of the Senate calls for it to be closed. So no longer could a small band of willful men bring this great Senate to a standstill. And that ability, or that requirement, to close debate then led to, well, okay, great. If we get a group of, well, once we had 100 senators, 41 senators initially, it was a smaller group, you needed 2/3 of the Senate in order to close debate. So you basically needed 34 senators who would agree to obstruct in order to keep a debate going. And that changed later on to a lower number. But the point is here, you now had this rule that tempted people to hold out the ability to close debate until they got their way. So it added to the kind of a level of paralysis. It provided a solution to a small group, but it provided a temptation to a larger group to obstruct the ability of the Senate to go forward. And then when that same power is taken up by the parties, it became quite a tool for the minority to wield against the majority. But again, until '65, it was basically rarely used on anything except civil rights. But then it started to be used on amendments and motions to proceed. And because it was designed to be used rarely, it was therefore designed to take up a lot of time. You have to file a petition to close debate at the desk. You have to wait an intervening day in order to vote. And after you vote to close debate, you still have to allow another 100 hours of debate. And that was later lowered to 30 hours of debate. But when this is done routinely, it just absolutely eats up the Senate time, and the Senate can't function. So this chapter, the unraveling, kind of saying how we got into this big mess of mutual assured obstruction of the minority against the majority. And the challenge that we have to get out of that cycle of deliberate obstruction if we're going to be able to meet the challenge of addressing the issues in a fast-changing society. So let's talk about another big challenge, and that's the weaponization of the Justice Department. When Donald Trump was campaigning for president in 2023, he told his followers, "I am your retribution." Retribution is exactly what we've seen since he returned to the White House. One recent example has been the indictment of Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton. Bolton wrote in his memoir that Trump is stunningly uninformed and easily manipulated by foreign leaders. Well, not something that sure made Trump happy to have John Bolton say that. After working for Trump, Bolton said, "I don't think he's fit for office. I don't think he has the competence to carry out the job." And Bolton was just one of the many Trump critics who is now in Trump's crosshairs. New York Magazine published a piece in April about these fears, titled "Trump Threatens to Imprison Critics," and Bondi might do it. It's written by Ellie Honig, April 11th of this year. Donald Trump's presidential payback tour rages on, and now it's personal. It's one thing to target multi-billion-dollar law firms, universities, and media outlets for organizational retribution. Those efforts aimed at stifling and punishing any criticism or dissent are reprehensible in their own right. But now Trump is going after individual private citizens, using the might of the executive branch to potentially throw his detractors in prison. In a pair of official proclamations, rendered no less unhinged by the use of official fonts and White House letterhead, Trump identifies two targets who worked in the federal government during his first tenure and dared to speak out publicly against him. First, Chris Krebs, who led the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency from 2018 to 2020, and made headlines when he publicly contradicted Trump's false claim that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. For this act of heretical truth-telling, Trump labels Krebs, quote, "a significant bad faith actor," whatever the hell that means, who poses grave risk to the American public. And then there's Miles Taylor, a former Department of Homeland Security official who publicly criticized the president in an anonymous book and various media appearances. Taylor, like Krebs, purportedly poses risk to the United States, is a bad faith actor, though apparently not a significant one, like Krebs, and stoked dissension with his public commentary. Are you scared? Don't you fear the risk posed by these two monsters? True to the form he's displayed when going after disfavored law firms, Trump hits below the belt. The president ordered security clearances stripped not only from Krebs and Taylor, but also from everyone who works with them. Krebs at a private security firm, Taylor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's punishing his targets, plus their employers and colleagues. First Amendment freedoms of association be darned. And those comments are not mine. I'm just reading the text here. It gets worse. In a separate set of orders, Trump directed the Attorney General to open criminal investigation of Krebs and Taylor. Notably absent from the orders is any plausible notion that either might have committed a federal crime. This hardly needs to be said. But it's not a federal crime to be a bad faith actor. It's not a federal crime to stoke dissension, or even to be a wise guy, as Trump called Krebs from the Oval Office. The next move is Pam Bondi's, and we know how this will go. Any reasonable, ethical attorney general would follow the bedrock principle that a prosecutor must have predication, a fancy word in quotes, some kernel of fact on which to believe a crime might have been committed in order to open a criminal investigation. The bar is low, but it serves the vital purpose of preventing precisely the baseless retributive inquest that Trump has now ordered up. In observance of this foundational precept, even Bill Barr, the subject of sharp criticism in my first book, Hatchet Man, generally ignored Trump's public pleas for the arrests of Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and others. Like the exhausted parent of an unruly toddler, Barr would mostly sit back and let the tantrum pass. Don't count on Bondi taking the same course of passive resistance to the president's. She has already shown her true colors, and they're whatever shade Trump pleases. Despite the distinct possibility of criminality by top administration officials around the signals scandal, the AG refused even to investigate. Instead, she decreed, after zero inquiry, with zero evidence, that information about military attack plans was somehow not classified and that nobody had acted recklessly. Case closed, no inquiry needed. Even if the DOJ investigates but concludes it cannot bring a criminal charge, the threats to Krebs and Taylor is real. Any criminal inquiry takes an enormous toll on the subject. Subpoenas fly. Friends and colleagues get pulled into the grand jury. Phones get seized and searched. Legal costs mount. Professional reputations suffer. Personal ties fray. Ask anyone who's been investigated by the Justice Department but not indicted. They will tell you it's a nightmare. Trump has long made a habit of threatening his opponents with criminal prosecution through social media posts and spontaneous outbursts from the lectern. Until now, it was mostly bluster, a public form of scream therapy for the capricious commander-in-chief. But now it's in writing from the president to the attorney general, who typically jumps to attention to serve whatever suits the boss. Prosecutorial standards be darned. Trump's dark fantasies are coming to life. So most of us haven't heard of these individuals. Miles Taylor, a Homeland Security official who criticized the president in a book. Krebs, who led a cybersecurity security agency for 2 years, and who simply contradicted Trump's false claim that the presidential election was stolen. Are those people to go after? They're not influential in the broader sense of being widely read, well-known, but taking and launching a criminal investigation out of them when you have no evidence of crime, you're just going on a witch hunt. The term that Trump loves to use so much when there's actual evidence But now here, there's no evidence. He's just going to make those folks miserable, and maybe break the bank for them because they'll have to spend all their money, might have to spend all their money, their resources, their savings on lawyers. That's pretty brutal use of the power of the federal government. And it not only hurts those it's directed against directly, it's meant as a message to everyone else. A message which says, you mess with me, you criticize me, you might be the next person that I tell the Attorney General to launch an aggressive criminal investigation against, even if I have no evidence you've done anything wrong. Well, that was in April. In September, the New York Times published a piece titled, "Trump Demands That Bondi Move Now to Prosecute Foes." September 20th, so basically a month ago. He said, or really, I guess the term is demanded, that his Attorney General move quickly to prosecute figures he considers his enemies, the latest blow to the Justice Department's tradition of independence. We can't delay any longer. It's killing our reputation and credibility, Mr. Trump wrote on a social media post addressed to Pam, meaning Attorney General Pam Bondi. They impeached me twice and indicted me 5 times over nothing. Justice must be served now. Mr. Trump named James B. Comey, the former FBI director, Senator Adam B. Schiff, Democrat of California, and Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, saying he was reading about how they were all guilty as hell, but nothing is going to be done, unquote. Asked later by reporters about his message for Ms. Bondi, Mr. Trump said, they have to act. They have to act fast. Even for a president who has shattered the traditional norms of maintaining distance from the Justice Department, Mr. Trump's unabashedly public and explicit orders to Ms. Bondi were an extraordinary breach of prosecutorial protocol that reached back to the days following the Watergate scandal. His demands came a day after he ousted the federal prosecutor who failed to charge 2 of the adversaries he most reviles, Mr. James, Miss James, and Mr. Comey, showing how far Mr. Trump had gone in exerting personal control over the Justice Department and breaching the long-standing norm about keeping politics at a distance from law enforcement. You know, it goes back to those words above the Supreme Court, equal justice under law. You're not targeted because the government doesn't like what you say. You're not targeted because you insult the president. No, you're targeted because there's evidence that you did something wrong, and like anyone else who did something wrong, you're investigated, but not because you're on the president's enemies list. That is the weaponization of the Justice Department that is so concerning. It is a feature of the authoritarian state. Use the power of government to go after individuals, causing them to flee the country, causing them to reverse their statements, causing them to spend vast sums on attorneys fighting the allegations, maybe destroy their career. And this little bit that we read about, how in one instance the federal government took the security clearances not just away from the 2 men, but the people they worked with. Well, nobody's going to hire you, so if you're going to kind of create a problem for the entire group to have their security clearances. So it's a collective punishment. Other innocent people brought into the attack strategy, all aimed at suppressing dissent, all aimed at undermining opponents and encouraging people not to say what they think. I used to say, one of the great things about America is you can stand up and criticize the most powerful man in the country, as long as you have your facts straight, and you get to do it because we have free speech. You get to express what you believe. You aren't in a country where you get disappeared or where you get targeted. But now I can't say that because we're in a country where you do get targeted, because the president is targeting people because of what they say about him or because they have played a role in the past. This is fabulously out of sync with freedom in our country. Freedom of speech, freedom to air your views, which makes for a much healthier country to have honesty in what we're observing so that people can act according to the insights that are produced. In a different social media post later on Saturday, I'm returning to the text here, Mr. Trump defended Ms. Bondi, saying she was doing a great job, but that she needed a tough prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia, where Eric S. Siebert was abruptly forced from his post atop the U.S. Attorney's Office on Friday. Mr. Trump said he would nominate Lindsay Halligan, a special assistant to the president, who was on his personal legal team, to fill the role. Ms. Halligan, who spent much of her career as an insurance lawyer, has never been a prosecutor. Ms. Siebert's exit deepened troubled questions that have arisen in recent months about the politicization of the Justice Department, supposedly self-governing satellite offices. But it also raised a blunter and more immediate issue. Which of the nation's U.S. attorneys might be next? Beyond their efforts to push out Mr. Siebert, whose inquiries into Ms. James and Mr. Comey effectively fizzled out, administration officials have also ramped up pressure against Kelly O'Hayes, the U.S. attorney in Maryland, according to 3 people familiar with the matter. Ms. Hayes, a career prosecutor who has spent more than a decade in that office, is leading inquiries into 2 other vocal critics of Mr. Trump. Mr. Schiff, who has been accused of mortgage fraud by Mr. Trump's allies, and John Bolton, Mr. Trump's former national security advisor, who is facing scrutiny over allegations of mishandling classified information. Recently, Ms. Hayes told associates that she was under no illusions of the pressure she would face if she refused to bring a case she believed to be unsupported by evidence, as Mr. Siebert did, according to people with knowledge of those conversations. And while she signed off last month on asking for a warrant to search Mr. Bolton's home in Bethesda, she has indicated that she would not bring charges against Mr. Schiff unless her team discovered evidence to support them. Mr. Trump's campaign against U.S. attorneys who oversee offices in 93 federal districts across the country is an extension, even an escalation, of the early purge that his top political appointees carried out at the Justice Department headquarters and the FBI against those who worked on the criminal cases brought against him before he returned to power. In other words, you investigated me because there was evidence of a crime. I'm coming after you now. Retribution. And in other cases, it's you disagreed with me and said that that the 2020 election was in fact valid, I'm coming after you and your office mates on top of that. This is a dictator. This is not a president. This is a dictator. This is a tyrant. A man who is proceeding to wipe out due process, to attack free speech, to attack freedom of the press, to weaponize the Justice Department, to seek to send the military in to attack peaceful protesters and have that military available in the future to suppress dissent. A man who in the weaponization Justice Department is operating on the mode of anyone who played a key role in the government. When they investigated me, I will go after them. Anyone who disagrees with what I say, I will go after them. Everyone beware of what you say. President Trump, why don't you pick on me? I'm criticizing you all through the night. It is important to understand that when you criticize the president, you are at risk of being a target. That is tyranny. That is not freedom. And together, Democrats and Republicans should respond and say this is 100% unacceptable. Democrats and Republicans together should take the case to the president and say, you know that how you're stealing the power of the purse? Not going to happen anymore. Now, we proposed a clause that would be in any continuing resolution that would say whatever has been agreed to in a bipartisan fashion can only be undone in a bipartisan fashion. So if something is adopted in a standard appropriation bill that has a 60-vote requirement, it would take 60 votes to undo it. We propose that because that way you're honoring the deal struck between the two parties. That's basically to stop the strategy of the president stealing the power of the purse and canceling programs after the fact. That is a reasonable request to honor the constitutional power invested in Congress. And I will keep raising that question and keep inviting my colleagues across the aisle. Let's join together, Democrats and Republicans together, to save our republic. This is not the vision of the nation that I think any single member of this body believed in when they were elected, a vision in which the rights of Americans are compromised, where freedom of speech is no longer in existence because you can be criminally prosecuted on a whim by the president when there's no evidence of a crime. Continuing with this article, but Trump's latest demand for the prosecution of his foes also underscores how his desire for retribution against those who pursued him after his first term remains as intense as ever, and how he appears to feel less constrained by political and legal norms in imposing payback. Given that these prosecutor officers are where federal cases are filed on a day-to-day basis, the move strikes at the nuts and bolts foundations of the criminal justice system. It seems intended both to create a frictionless path for prosecutions of those who have run afoul of Mr. Trump, and perhaps to provide the White House with a tool it could use to set aside or slow cases it would like to see disappear. White House interference in the work of U.S. attorneys was once considered such a taboo that former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, who served under President George Bush, resigned in scandal after the Justice Department fired 9 U.S. attorneys in 2006 for what were perceived to be political reasons. But Trump's reaction to Siebert's ouster could not have been more different. Several people, including Bondi and Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General and the President's former defense lawyer, lobbied hard to keep Siebert in place, arguing that he had been an efficient and cooperative partner in immigration and crime enforcement in Washington's southern suburbs. But Trump responded to repeated entries by saying, quote, "I don't care," according to a person with knowledge of the matter. His position seemed to be he had been warned several times during his first term about firing U.S. attorneys, given they could have put him in jeopardy, and he ended up being investigated after leaving office anyhow. Well, this article goes on to provide additional detail, but it says near its end, since returning to office, Mr. Trump and his allies have often sought to justify their attacks on U.S. attorneys by claiming the justice system under President Biden had been weaponized against his predecessor. Still, there is no evidence that federal law enforcement officials in the Biden administration were strong-armed into bringing or dropping prosecutions for what were overtly political reasons, nor were there any high-profile resignations by U.S. attorneys under Mr. Biden that were similar to Mr. Siebert's resignation on Friday. So the attorneys followed the facts, what they're supposed to do, without encouragement or influence from the president under Biden, and now they're being instructed, as opposed to no influence and no instruction, they're being instructed who to go after. So much has gone on that it's hard to track it. In these various categories we've talked about, even in the weaponization of the Justice Department, some of the cases are against individuals that the president has on his enemies list. Others are after career employees who aren't doing exactly what the president wants to pursue those criminal investigations against people on the target list. Then we have more going on. The Department of Justice fired attorneys and other staff who were involved in the January 6th investigations and prosecutions. So we have the criminal prosecutions of people on the enemies list, of Trump's enemies list. We have the firing of attorneys in the prosecutor's office. And now we have the firing of attorneys and staff who were involved in January 6 investigations. More than a dozen FBI agents were fired because during 2020 they had kneeled with protesters in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And Trump has publicly called for investigations into other political enemies, as we have seen. The Comey indictment has received a particularly significant amount of attention. The Brennan Center provided some input on this. The power of the prosecutor is tremendous, impacting the life and liberty of those whose conduct brings them within the criminal justice system. Prosecutors decide who gets charged and what crimes they get charged with. They make influential recommendations about sentencing. That's why it's essential for prosecution to stay independent of politics. Justice demands that prosecutors make decisions based solely on the facts and the law, without fear or favor. Without fear or favor. No one can be above the law or unfairly subjected to it. New federal prosecutors learn about former Attorney General and Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson's views which, although stated in 1940, resonate powerfully today. Quote, "The prosecutor's discretion is tremendous. He can have citizens investigated, and if he is that kind of person, he can have this done to the tune of public statements, veiled or unveiled intimations. The prosecutor can order arrests, present case to the grand jury in secret session. On the basis of one-sided presentation of the facts can cause the citizen to be indicted and held for trial. While the prosecutor at his best is one of the most beneficent forces in our society, when he acts from malice or other base motives, he is one of the worst." There are echoes of Jackson's warning last week when the Justice Department indicted one of the president's political opponents, Lindsay Halligan, President Trump's former personal lawyer and newly installed U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, went to the grand jury, apparently alone, to invite former FBI Director James Comey for allegedly lying to Congress, congressional investigation. Trump turned to Halligan after her predecessor, Eric Siebert, an experienced career prosecutor who Trump himself had tapped to lead the office, declined to prosecute Comey due to insufficient evidence. So a seasoned prosecutor, a career prosecutor, which Trump himself had tapped to leave the office, said there is insufficient evidence to prosecute Comey and declined to do so. There's credible reporting that prosecutors in the office had serious concerns about the case. That prompted Trump to put out a Truth Social post that read like a text message to Attorney General Pam Bondi, than something you would expect to see from a president on social media. "Pam, I have reviewed over 30 statements and posts saying that essentially, same old story as last time, all talk, no action, nothing is being done. What about Comey? What about Adam, Shifty Schiff? What about Letitia? They're all guilty as hell. Nothing is going to be done." Then we almost put a Democrat-supported U.S. attorney in Virginia with a really bad Republican past, a woke rhino who is never going to do his job. That's why two of the worst Democratic senators pushed him so hard. He even lied to the media and said he quit and that we had no case. No, I fired him, and there is great case, and many lawyers and legal pundits say so. Lindsay Halligan is a really good lawyer and likes you a lot. We can't delay any longer. It's killing our reputation, our credibility. They impeached me twice. They indicted me 5 times over nothing. Justice must be served now. President, DJT. This level of presidential interference in prosecutorial decision-making contradicts everything our country has done in the post-Watergate era to protect against corruption of the justice system. So, firing FBI agents, directing the Attorney General publicly to go after folks that he doesn't like, going after attorneys who don't prosecute in the fashion. There's a lot, a lot, article after article. This one I actually, maybe an additional element that I wasn't so familiar with. In late September, President Trump signed an executive order designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. A few days later, he issued the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7 on countering domestic terrorism and organized political violence. This analysis evaluates claims made in these documents and their potential damaging effects, drawing on the Brennan Center decade of work on the government's framework for responding to terrorism, foreign and domestic. Both the order and the memo are ungrounded in fact and law. Acting on them would violate free speech rights, potentially threatening any person or group holding any one of a broad array of disfavored views with investigation and prosecution. So this is another weapon, another aspect of the weaponization of the Justice Department. If you think that there is a philosophy you don't like. And in this case, Antifa is more philosophy than organization. Call it a domestic terrorist organization. That puts individuals and their free speech at great risk. And the memo from the Brennan Center goes in to note all the details about how this doesn't stand up to take any to be basically used to suppress domestic dissent, free speech, by labeling a domestic group a terrorist organization. Building on its framing of the threat from anti-fascism as a wide-ranging conspiracy and domestic terrorism, NSPM 7 directs government agents to go after all participants in these criminal and terroristic conspiracies, including the organized structures, networks, entities, organizations, funding sources, and predicate actions behind them. This memorandum directs the Joint Terrorism Task Force to coordinate and supervise a comprehensive national strategy to investigate, prosecute, disrupt entities and individuals engaged in acts of political violence, intimidation designed to suppress lawful political activity, obstruction under the law. Of course, whenever there is criminal activity, hell yes, enforce the law. But if you're putting a major label on a group because of their viewpoints, that is something entirely different. So that certainly deserves close examination as another facet. This one, a little more complicated and not feeling like the total framework is completed as to how this is intended to be used or acted on and how it will affect those who might have anti-fascist views, but it certainly appears like it's a strategy to take folks you disagree with and label them a terrorist threat when there may be absolutely no such threat at all. Finally, let me read a message from the organization, The Justice Connection, a group of former career employees of the Department of Justice who left DOJ, either voluntarily or involuntarily, because of actions of the Trump administration. Urgent message from the recent DOJ alumni decrying attacks on the Justice Department. 2-page letter. And Madam President, I ask that this letter be entered into the record.
Objection.
Urgent message. We are 282 former career employees who proudly served our country at the Department of Justice, from prosecutors, special agents, and intelligence analysts to immigration judges, grant managers, civil rights attorneys, and more. We all carried out our duties faithfully, regardless of who occupied the White House, until we no longer could. Each of us left the department either voluntarily or involuntarily because of actions taken by this administration. Our fidelity to the Constitution and our dedication to our country did not end when our jobs did. Now that we've left the department, we believe it's our duty to sound the alarm about this administration's degradation of DOJ's vital work and its assault on the public servants who do it. It is incumbent on all of us to fight for the Justice Department before it's too late. It is incumbent on all of us to fight for the Justice Department before it's too late. The DOJ's mission is to uphold the rule of law, to keep our country safe, to protect civil rights. It's failing on 3 fronts. And I see a colleague has arrived on the floor, and I'm happy to interrupt the reading of this letter. But because of your own background, I suspect you might possibly have some question related to some of these miscarriages of justice. I see my colleague from Minnesota is on the floor, and I would welcome a question if she has one.
Will the senator from Oregon yield? I have one question, and it is about just the Justice Department. We just got the shocking news yesterday. It's every single day something happens, that once again the president is treating the Justice Department as his own personal law firm. He has now asked for, and this might have been while the senator from Oregon was speaking, but the president has now requested $230 million back from the taxpayers of this country off of their backs to line his own pockets, or he says now to give to a charity of his choice. And to me, this is just another example of how he keeps considering the Justice Department as it should be, not as the people's lawyer, but as his own lawyers. And in fact, he has installed his own lawyers there. He has done everything from decided to pardon George Santos and pardon his friends, to prosecute his so-called enemies, including firing career prosecutors to allow him to install a White House aide to go after his enemies. And so one of my obsessions with having watched this from the Judiciary Committee is just how that can be justice. And I think it does tie in with everything else that's happening. You know, he is focusing on getting $230 million that he doesn't deserve back into his pocket instead of helping the American people get health care. He's focused on helping his pals and his friends and going after his enemies instead of doing the work for the American people that he was elected to do. So I would just like to have my colleague from Oregon answer a question about how he sees this Justice Department fraud and what's happening over there as related to how the president isn't doing anything for regular people, and instead he's helping his pals.
Well, I thank so much my colleague and friend from Minnesota and the expertise you bring on the Justice Department. As a lawyer, you have the background as you serve on the committee that has this jurisdiction. And I, as a non-lawyer, can tell you I am just absolutely shocked and stunned. I have thought that the norms that we have in America are norms that make a great deal of sense because they have a value associated with them. And that value is the fair administration of justice without prejudice, the fair administration without targeting of political enemies. I think, I read about the targeting of political enemies. That happened in some country far away, where a president who didn't share the values that we have here in the United States of America went after their political enemies by falsely pursuing them in a criminal sense. But then I realized that, no, that's happening right here in the United States of America. And you made reference to a situation that I believe I may have heard about and may have this wrong, in which the president is actually suing the government, then instructing his Department of Justice to settle the suit, thereby translating money into the president's pocket out of the government. I mean, are you kidding me? What is the president of the United States? I will file a suit against the government, and then I'll tell the Justice Department to pay it off and put that money in my pocket? I mean, I was just stunned by reading that new version. There is no limit to the self-serving. I must say, in that case, it's money. But when the president has an enemies list, and when the president instructs Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, to go and find something on that person in order to make their life miserable, this is absolutely horrific, because it's not just about targeting that person, which is bad enough. It's about suppressing dissent or enforcing loyalty, suppressing dissent by anyone else and saying to everybody else, you better do exactly what I say. I can issue a pardon if you do what I say and it's illegal, but I can issue a subpoena and prosecute you if you violate, well, if you fail to do exactly what I want.
Will the senator from Oregon yield for a question?
I would love to yield to another question.
So when you look at how this all started, I think about all of these people who have stood up, as you are standing up today. I think about career prosecutors in the Justice Department who have basically said, no, I am not going to do the bidding of the president, whether I was appointed during a Republican presidency or a Democratic presidency, whether I personally vote Republican or vote Democrat. I have a job to do, and that is follow the laws of the United States. And I think the real first indication of this, where people realized just how off the cliff this was going, was when, in fact, there was pressure put on career prosecutors in New York to dismiss these charges that had been the result of a long investigation involving Mayor Eric Adams. And what I remember from that time was Danielle Sassoon, who was a very, very well-respected conservative prosecutor, someone that came up through the Federalist Society, who had clerked for conservative justices, that she decided to resign rather than do their bidding because she felt that it wasn't consistent with the law, that was against the law. And then another career prosecutor named Hagan Scotton, who was a decorated veteran who had clerked for then Judge Kavanaugh and Justice Roberts. He said, when asked to file a motion in that case, you may find a fool or a coward to file that motion, but it won't be me. And those words always echo in my mind. I say to the senator from Oregon as he stands up today, of these people through these last month, whether it is standing to march with their kids on their hips, whether it is to stand up, as so many of us have done in this chamber, to fight for health care, whether it is people who, like the statistician at the Labor Department, simply doing her job, willing to stand up and give the facts of what the job numbers were, and then the president didn't like it and had her fired, which I always thought was ironic when it's about jobs numbers and then you lose another job. But in any case, he just fired her, or going after governors at the Federal Reserve, or deciding which states he's going to take funding from. In my home state of Minnesota, as I know you've experienced in Oregon, he cut a bunch of energy projects. And I looked at the list, I thought, wait a minute, these are all grid projects. So many of them were major, major projects with private companies to provide energy in neighboring states like North Dakota and South Dakota. I kind of looked at the list and saw all the funding because the company was based in Minnesota, but all the funding for our surrounding red states. And I just thought, oops, I guess they didn't mean to put this on the list. All of that combines, as you look at what's happening with the Justice Department right now, as a president that is basically decided that there are no norms. And so the only norms left is this body because the House has decided they're not coming back right now. They're waiting for these Epstein files that they hope will just go away, but it appears they will never go away. They won't even seat a duly elected member of Congress from Arizona because they're so afraid of these Epstein files. So while that's going on, and they're basically decided to just stay home and hang out and not come to work every day, this is the functioning chamber, as close as it can come, that is supposed to be dealing with the matters before the country. And the matter before the country right now is what is happening with our health care system. On November 1st, these premiums are going to be doubling in so many states. You look at some of the states that actually Donald Trump won, like Florida with millions and millions of people on these plans. You look at Texas, 75% of the people on these plans live in states, that Donald Trump won. So while all that is going on, the president goes to his go-to, and his go-to is messing around with the justice system. He literally pardoned someone, as in George Santos, who claimed to be a world-class volleyball player, producer of the Spider-Man movie, and was actually simply a fraudster that the entire Republican leadership in the House of Representatives booted out of the House of Representatives. The president says, I'm going to bring this guy back too. Because every single day, it's that strong arm techniques. Doesn't care if it leads to more violence, doesn't care if it violates the oath of these lawyers in the Justice Department, doesn't care if people get fired, doesn't care about, what does matter? What does appear to matter is making news that day. What does appear to matter is getting on, dominating the news that day. Not our country, not the rule of law, but the one thing I can say, and I ask this of my friend, the senator from Oregon, because the president seems to think this, but does in fact trump the Constitution? Isn't it a fact that our laws and our Constitution, which has withstood wars, withstood the Great Depression, withstood Watergate, withstood all these things. Why? Because people stood up, as the senator from Oregon is doing today. Judges stood up, as we're seeing across the country. There are Trump-appointed judges that have made decisions time and time again contrary to this administration because it's against the rule of law. We saw that in the tariff case, those tariffs that are burdening the small businesses in our state. We saw a Trump-appointed judge, a Reagan-appointed judge, an Obama-appointed judge join together and say the tariffs are illegal. So this is happening. Judges are standing up. Our constituents are standing up, as we saw over this last weekend, millions and millions of people standing up in what was the most biggest peaceful protest in the history of this country. And yes, Congress needs to stand up. And that's what the senator from Oregon is doing today. Standing up and saying, this is not normal. This is not normal to have a Justice Department that is doing what they're doing. So I do ask the senator from Oregon, despite him not being a lawyer, to talk about the fact that Donald Trump cannot trump the Constitution of the United States.
I thank so much the question my colleague from Minnesota has laid out. In fact, at least 8 or so topics that I'm going to enjoy addressing. But your final point, does Trump the Constitution? Do we have kings, if you will, in the United States of America? And the answer is, under the Constitution, obviously not. And I so appreciated the name of Saturday's demonstration. 7 million people demonstrating at some 2,700 sites across America saying no kings, and many versions of the most creative possible statistics laid out, of pictures laid out in that process. But you are absolutely, your question, there are no kings under our Constitution. But the president, in all of these things that I've laid out through the course of the night, the attack on the rule of law, the continuous effort to suppress free speech and free press, the attack on due process, attack on the law firms, attack on the universities, the use of violence, and the weaponizing the DOJ, all of it is the way a king acts. So in fact, we are in the middle of an authoritarian takeover. It's not down the street, it's not around the corner, it is here right now. And speaking of being here right now, I see my minority leader is on the floor from New York, and I would welcome a question if he has one.
Well, first, thank you, and I do have a question for you. I want to commend you for your fortitude and your strength on a subject that is so important to the future of this country, not only for our generation, but for our grandchildren. We need a democracy, and my question is this. In many authoritarian regimes, there are many characteristics, and we see a lot of this happening in Hungary, in fact. Orban has had his friends take over the media. Orban has used the prosecutorial authorities as a weapon, as Trump has turned our whole Justice Department into an attack dog to go after his enemies and help his friends. And we see this in so many other countries. Now, there are many people in the United States say it can't happen here, and our roots of democracy are stronger and deeper, certainly, than in Hungary's. But the danger is real. And could my friend, and I so respect what he has done all night, could my friend just elaborate on the question, it is different here, but why can we not be complacent when we've seen what happens in other countries like Hungary, like Turkey, and of course, even more severe dictatorships? When people say it won't happen here, why should we, even though we're different, why should Americans from every political corner, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, be fighting this authoritarian rise in this country led by Donald Trump, who, as you said, wants to be king?
I so appreciate the question from the minority leader from New York. And one of the things that I certainly felt was, this can't happen here. Our institutions are too old. We have 200 years of practice. We have features that have helped reinforce our constitutional framework. We have a solid middle class. We have a good education system. We have deep traditions in the House and Senate. We have norms that reinforce our constitutional understandings. And yet, it turns out that my confidence that authoritarianism cannot take hold in America is wrong. And one of the things I have done over the course of the night is to read multiple chapters and commentary to professors who looked at countries all over the world, including Hungary, and said, here's how it happened. They said, we used to think about the end of a democracy as being something done by men with guns. They burned down the presidential palace, they shot the president, maybe they killed his family, they tore up the Constitution, and they said, here's the New Deal. But now, that rarely happens in comparison to the new version in which democracies are put into the grave. And that new version is by elected individuals who start to erode the separation of powers. And if you think about it that way, you just really need three things to become an authoritarian state. You need a Congress that says our role is to just back up and do what the president says, a rubber stamp Congress. And in large part, we have that right now. I can't tell you how many times colleagues have said, I can't take that position because it would upset the president, even though I'm not happy about the situation. Well, so there's that. And then you need a court that confirms or conveys more power to the president. And we have seen court decision after court decision that have conveyed more power, like Trump versus United States, saying the president is above the law. And you combine the president being above the law, as long as it's shielded by an act of government, and pardon power, and now the whole executive branch feels, well, we're all above the law. And then the president comes into office and just starts ignoring one law after another. I think a real early one that got a lot of attention was the firing of inspector generals. And of course, the law says you have to fire them for cause. And the law says you have to give 30 days notice. But the president didn't either. And in the end, he didn't really get the courts saying you can't do that. And then Trump says, you know what, I'm just going to start establishing tariffs around the world. Well, tariffs are not a power delegated to the president. The very first bill the U.S. Senate ever worked on was a tariff bill. They spent 3 weeks assigning a tariff to different things, a keg of nails or a barrel of molasses and so on and so forth. And so this collective factor brings us to the third element that creates the authoritarian state, which is a president who wants to defy the law, create a space in which saying the laws do not apply. So suddenly the checks and balances are gone, and it's not the authoritarianism that we need to fear a year from now. It's here at this very moment. And so this is why we should all, if we had any doubts a year ago, we should all now be going, oh my God, we are not immune from the same strategy that's been pursued with the same authoritarian playbook in country after country after country.
Thank my colleague for that really right on the money exposition of this, and I'd just like to ask one more question related to the first, the supine Congress. Our Republican colleagues seem to just do whatever Trump wants, and we hear lots of mumbling and grumbling, we don't like it. But I hear from some of them saying to me, it wouldn't make a difference if I spoke up. Does my colleague from Oregon agree with that it wouldn't make a difference, that if Republicans, whether at the leadership in the House or Senate, or a large number or even a decent number of members spoke up against the kind of authoritarian direction that Trump is taking, does my colleague think it wouldn't make a difference, as they say, or does he think it would?
Well, I believe it would make an astounding difference, because when I come to the floor, or any of my Democratic colleagues come to the floor and say, look at this attack on due process, this is just wrong. Look at this effort to tell universities what to teach, this is just wrong. Look at the attack on law firms, and they've been essentially blackmailed into $1 billion of free legal help to groups that Trump